All right, so for lesson 5.2, we are going over Pythagorean theorem again. So this is review from grade 9, but we're just going to go over it another time. So when we take a look at this, the first thing that we are going to do is label all the sides. So remember, h is our specific one. Oftentimes you will see this as a squared plus b squared is equal to c squared. This is always our longest line. So in this case, it's this one right here. Reason why it's written as h there is because it's the hypotenuse. Which means this can be A, this can be B. That must be a right angle. It's the only way we can use Pythagorean theorem is if we are working with a right angle triangle. If the hypotenuse squared is not equal to the sum of A and B squared, then it is not a right triangle. And that's one that you know to start off with no matter what. The first thing I always want you to do, because the common mistake that I always end up seeing, is label your hypotenuse first. The hypotenuse is always opposite of the right angle. Okay, so if we take a look here and we do some examples, first thing that we are going to do is label our hypotenuse. Always opposite your right angle. Every single time. If you can't remember that, remember it's the longest line that you have, and then we'll figure out where to go from there. Between that, it doesn't matter which one's A and which one's B. I'm just going to call the hypotenuse C because that's the way I've always learned it, and that's the way I've always taught it, so it just keeps things a little bit more consistent. So I know that in this case, if I'm trying to calculate the value of x, that is my C value. So I know that a squared plus b squared is equal to c squared. If I want to determine what my c squared value is, what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug in 3 for a plus 4 for b, because that's how I determined it, is equal to c squared. 3 squared is 9 plus 16 is equal to c squared, which gives us 25 is equal to c squared. I'm not done yet because I have this little squared value. To do the opposite of that, I'm going to square root it. Square root of 25 is 5, and that leaves me with c. So in this case, our hypotenuse is 5. If we take a look at this next example, I have, again, c squared equals a squared plus b squared. This time I'm looking for b, though. So c squared is 13 squared is equal to 5 squared for a plus b squared. 13 squared is one of the few I don't know off the top of my head. 169 is equal to 25 plus b squared. Now we need to isolate for b. So 25 is going to come over, and I'll get 169 minus 25 gives us 144 is equal to b squared. Now I need to square root both sides. Square root of 144 is 12 is equal to b. So I know that b, or w in this case, is 12 as far as its length goes. You can rearrange your equation to start off with. That is oftentimes what I will end up doing, but just so you see where the steps come from, that's what we're doing. So now if we take a look at another example, I have that a fabricated roof truss is manufactured with the dimensions shown. The quality assurance inspector checks to make sure the supports do form a right angle triangle. This is one, if you ever want to go into anything like the trades or construction, right angle triangles, Pythagorean theorem, angles, this is a unit that you will use on a daily basis. The allowance for error is 0.2 meters. Determine whether the truss is acceptable. In the case of construction, manufacturing, anything like that, if you do not have a perfectly right angle triangle and your allowance is outside of the error allowance that's given to you, or your error is outside of the allowance that's given to you, that is where buildings collapse. So they try to make sure that you stay within that range. So if I take a look here, this is supposed to be a 2 and a 6. And this is supposed to be 6.34. My apologies about that. Don't know why those didn't appear. First thing I'm going to do, find my right angle triangle. That is the one that's supposed to be a right angle. Oh, the number shifted over here. That's why. Opposite of that is my hypotenuse. So this is my C value. We'll say 2 is A and 6 is B. So if I'm taking a look, what I want to do is make sure that those are equal to each, or that they are a right angle triangle. So when I'm doing this, I'm going to have C squared is equal to A squared plus B squared. C squared is 6.34 squared is equal to 2.01 squared plus 6.01 squared. And then I'm just going to take a look and make sure that that equation actually works out. So this ends up being 40.1956. 2.01 squared is 4.0401 plus 6.01 squared is 36.1201. We're going to add our 4.0401 to that, and I will get 40.1602. So I can see that these values are not the same. Now I need to check if they're within my allowance for error. So all I'm going to do here is I'm just going to subtract them from one another. 4.1956 minus 40.1602. This gives me 0.0354. We know our allowance of error is 0.2 meters. 0.354 is not acceptable. Therefore, the truss is not acceptable within the error allowance. So if you were working on the building that had this truss for the roof, you would not be allowed to use this. You would end up having to redo it before you built the roof. That's everything for this lesson.